IBESS Biodiversity Conservation Part 9 analyzes two approaches towards conservation: the species-based approach as compared to the habitat-based approach. The essential ideas are the impact of losing biodiversity drives conservation efforts, and the variety of arguments given for the conservation of biodiversity will depend on environmental value systems, and there are various approaches to the conservation of biodiversity, each with associated strengths and weaknesses. Here is the outline for the biodiversity conservation movies. Use this slide to find the movie you need for review purposes. This movie is focused here: habitat and species-based approaches to conservation. Here is the IB syllabus statement that will drive this movie forward. Describe and evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the species-based approach to conservation and the habitat-based approach to conservation. Let's back up just a bit from the IB syllabus statement on the last slide to ask, how do we approach conservation? Do we promote one species more than another? Do we promote one habitat more than another? How do we construct laws that protect species, that protect habitats? How do we appeal to people, the voters, the donors? How do we not harm people in the effort? What's interesting is that people relate differently to the conservation of the natural world. There is no general consensus about the natural world and how to manage it. In fact, attitudes towards nature vary and are by no means universally benign. So let's look at the species-based approach to conservation, and I ask what types of species would be singled out in a species-based approach to conservation, with the understanding that we don't have the monetary resources to conserve all species at the same time. We must make some decisions. Should we protect the ecologically important species, such as keystone species, but there are no rules about what constitutes a keystone species? Should we protect threatened species? How do we know what species are most threatened? How do we evaluate the data? We know a lot about birds and mammals, but not much about others. What about aesthetic or charismatic species? Some species are charismatic, some aren't, while others are important for religious or spiritual reasons. Or should we focus on the species that are useful to people? Take note that the specific conservation activities that serve the species-based approach will be examined later in this movie. Our environmental values might guide us in singling out species in the species-based approach to conservation. Ecocentrist choices might include the keystone species, umbrella species, indicator species, or species that are rare, while anthropocentrist choices might be the aesthetic species with emotional resonance, flagship species, and species that provide resources, particularly genetic resources. Ecocentrist choices might include any species, certainly any threatened species, because of the philosophical idea that all species have a right to exist beyond any value to humans. A species-based approach for ecocentrists would include the idea that all species have a right to exist beyond any value to humans. A species-based approach might include keystone species, but there are no rules about what constitutes a keystone species. In this example, otters are keystone species because they eat urchins, and the urchins eat the kelp. Without the otters, urchins bloom, kelp becomes damaged, and diversity declines. A species-based approach might include umbrella species, such as the leopard. Umbrella species require large territories. Thus, by conserving umbrella species, we conserve many species. In fact, we conserve the habitat. Umbrella species like the tiger require large territories as a top predator. If large areas are protected for the purposes of protecting the tiger, other species are also conserved. The species-based approach might include indicator species. The presence of indicator species is a sign of the general health of the ecosystem. Pollinators, for example, or amphibians are both indicator species. An ecocentric species-based approach toward conservation would also include species whose numbers are low, rare species. Here is a photo I took of a mountain gorilla in Uganda. The numbers of mountain gorillas are low, and the distribution of the gorilla habitat is limited. Rare species require conservation efforts. The California condor was quite rare in 1985. All condors were removed from the wild in an effort to restore the population through captive breeding. The bird numbers have rebounded into the hundreds, and condors have been reintroduced to the wild. This is a species-based approach, but it can be, as it was in this example, expensive. That said, this species-based approach is very clear in its focus. Continuing with an examination of a species-based approach to conservation, let's consider anthropocentric choices for conservation. People are charmed by the aesthetic, the charismatic species. We emotionally identify with species for aesthetic reasons. Is this species important to conserve? And why? Is it expensive to conserve? Conservation efforts often favor the aesthetically pleasing animals and plants. But are they important to conserve? Are they costly to conserve? And what about those species that are not aesthetically pleasing? As a note, endemic species, species that can be found nowhere else, are of particular interest to conservationists. The okapi, seen here, is endemic to the forests of the eastern Congo River Basin. Flagship species gather popular support and serve to galvanize efforts to conserve species. Apply what you know about how NGOs operate. If NGOs can raise funds using flagship species, other species might also be conserved. Why do we find some organisms appealing, like the red panda, that might be a flagship species, and some less so? And how do our cultural preferences influence the species that people decide to conserve? Information about species is often incomplete, especially on the less conspicuous species. Why would we not protect these organisms if they were rare? Information about species is often incomplete, especially on the less conspicuous species. A strong benefit of the species-based approach is that we know exactly what it is that we're conserving. We know exactly what we're spending money on. But the species-based approach can be expensive, a lot of money for the purposes of conserving one species. Interestingly, there is no general consensus about the natural world and attitudes towards it. You can see in this quote that not everyone cares about nature or the conservation of species. Not everybody cares about the fate of wild animals or the state of the natural environment. I met a lady who said she wouldn't worry if all the wild animals in the world disappeared overnight. She was a city person, she said. And lastly, a species-based approach to conservation could include species of use to people for the resources that they might provide. Consider the species that provide genetic resources. The genes of specific species might provide us with salt tolerance in plants, fish that grow at faster rates, or rice plants that can make their own vitamin A. Here is a slide that evaluates the species-based approach to conservation. Strengths. Conservation effort has clear focus, including laws and penalties. Generates an interest in conservation. Generates money. Efforts to conserve species prevent species extinction through captive breeding in zoos. Zoos serve to educate and increase awareness. And if one species receives a protection, maybe the habitat also receives protection. The limitations are that it's narrow in its focus. Many species require attention, not just a few. The species-based approach does not focus on services, ecological services. It's also expensive. It's expensive per species conserved. And there is no consensus on which species we should conserve. Now let's shift our focus to examine a habitat-based approach to conservation. Which habitats would be selected for habitat-based conservation, and what are the activities that serve habitat-based conservation? So I ask, what types of habitats would be singled out in a habitat-based approach to conservation? Environmental values systems might guide us. The ecocentrist choices would be habitats that are diverse, or provide ecological services, or are aesthetically pleasing or spiritual to humans, or are threatened. The anthropocentrist choices would be habitats that are aesthetic, provide ecotourism or provide recreation, or habitats that provide resources, particularly genetic resources. Before going any further, it's important to say that the habitat-based approach is a very good approach to conservation. If we can conserve habitat, we conserve many species and ecological services, and the cost per species conserved would be less. Services cost society nothing. Large tracts of undisturbed ecosystems are diverse ecosystems worthy of conservation. But what does the habitat-based conservation approach look like? Do we use fences? Do we have boundaries around ecosystems? Some ecosystems are less diverse than others, but even systems of low diversity might have unique species, endemic species, species found nowhere else. By protecting habitat, many species are protected, and this is what makes the habitat-based approach so effective. And, in addition, services come from intact habitats, services that cost us nothing. But how do we appeal to people on the basis of habitat? How do we appeal to people such that we're willing to set aside tracts of land? Biodiversity is a matter of location. Conservation efforts could be justified in habitats of high diversity, but we must look at the scale of diversity. 1 square meter of European chalkland will have more species diversity than 1 square meter of a tropical rainforest. But the reverse would be true if we examined 1 square kilometer of the two systems. And certain ecosystems are aesthetically important or spiritually important. Would people choose to protect aesthetically or spiritually important ecosystems over others? For example, the Fimbos ecosystem in South Africa is interesting because there are over 9,000 different species of plants, 6,200 of which are endemic. Yet few people know of the Fimbos because its scrubby vegetation is not immediately aesthetically pleasing. So how do we get people to conserve the Fimbos habitat if it's not well known or it's not particularly attractive? And as we consider diversity, what is of greater importance? Richness, the number of different species, or the number of endemic species, the number of different species that can be found nowhere else? If the habitat is not terribly diverse, should it be conserved, even if it's a habitat for something unique? So as we consider diversity, what's of greater importance? Richness, the number of different species, or the number of endemic species, the number of different species that can be found nowhere else? To focus only on diverse habitats, the hotspots, can be narrow in conception. Such focus ignores important species. We must also be aware to look at the scale of diversity. As I've mentioned previously, 1 square meter of European chalkland will have more species diversity than 1 square meter of tropical rainforest. But the reverse would be true if we examined 1 square kilometer of each system. Should this grassland biome be protected, or would it make good agricultural land? How do we convince people that the intact, undisturbed system has value? Giving land legal status is the normal approach toward habitat-based conservation. As well, putting a monetary value on the services would raise the value of intact, undisturbed systems. The ecosystem approach focuses on maintaining functioning ecosystems, but our understanding of the functioning of whole ecosystems is often limited. The hotspot approach is a habitat approach. It's a comparative approach, a relative approach among different systems, examining total diversity, endemics, endangered species. It's important to evaluate the threats, the rate of habitat loss, evaluate the degree of current protection, the strength of enforcement, evaluate the data, mapping, species distribution, surveys. There's a need for detailed species distribution data in the conservation of habitats. How do we decide what constitutes a habitat to be conserved? How is the hotspot designation decided? Is it on the basis of endangered species, endemics, total diversity, the richness of the region? Or is it because it's located in a less economically developed country, so it's vulnerable to disturbance? Or could it be aesthetics? The Convention on Biological Diversity advocates the conservation of genes, species, and ecosystems, but it's rarely, if ever, a practical possibility to operate at all three levels, so decisions still have to be made about which aspects of biological diversity deserve priority. It's important to look at the scale of diversity. As I've mentioned, 1 square meter of European chalkland will have more species diversity than 1 square meter of tropical forest. But the reverse is true if we look at 1 square kilometer of each system. And as we consider diversity, what's of greater importance? Richness or the number of endemic species? And if a habitat is to be conserved, will people have to be moved? What about the traditional homes and communities in the region? And who will provide compensation? So let's evaluate the habitat-based approach toward conservation. The strengths are no conservation bias, many species are protected, ecological services are protected, protected habitats are usually under government protection with taxpayer monies, there are laws and penalties, and it's relatively inexpensive on a per-species basis. The limitations are that monitoring or guarding the boundaries can be difficult and can be expensive. Animal migration patterns do not adhere to political boundaries. Governments must defend monies spent on park protection. Is the habitat of interest to the electorate, the people that elect governments? And governments must defend the protection of large tracts of land against the economic interests involved in the exploitation of the resources on the land. So as we have examined what types of species and habitats would be singled out in a conservation effort, let's turn our attention to the conservation activities that serve the species-based approach to conservation. Specific activities that focus on the conservation of species includes laws, such as CITES, the Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species. It includes captive breeding programs with the aim of increasing population numbers and reintroduction to the wild. And lastly, zoos. The Convention for the International Trade of Endangered Species was signed by 175 countries in 1973. CITES lists 900 species that cannot be traded, and it restricts the trade of 5,000 animals and 28,000 plant species. CITES is a strongly species-based approach to conservation. Evidence of CITES can be found in airports world over. Certain national laws also focus on species. For example, the Endangered Species Act of 1973 in the United States had 1,300 species listed by the year 2006. The Endangered Species Act forbids federal agencies of carrying out, funding, or authorizing projects that would jeopardize an endangered species or its habitat. The Act demands $100,000 fines and 1-year jail terms for offenses on private land. 80% of the listed species live totally or partially on private land. Captive breeding is an important species-based approach to conservation, and it serves to save species from extinction. Captive breeding is expensive, but when the effort has been made to increase the number of individuals of a certain species, success has been high. The California condor was nearly extinct, with 22 animals left in 1987. All animals were removed from the wild for the purposes of captive breeding, including the use of puppets to feed the chicks. Today, there are over 400 condors, and they have been reintroduced to their native habitat. Captive breeding of the condor was very expensive at $35 million. The Arabian oryx, once extinct in the wild, has been returned to the wild through captive breeding. Zoos would also be considered a species-based approach to conservation. Zoos serve the role of educating the public, protection of a species under threat, and raising money that could be used in conservation efforts more broadly. Zoos have the long-term goal of returning species to the wild, if that's possible. Often it's not possible to return a species to its original habitat because the habitat is gone. The controlled condition of the zoo allows for the possibility of using techniques such as artificial insemination for increasing the chances of successful reproduction. As well, the controlled condition of the zoo allows for crossbreeding that increases the genetic diversity within a population. Zoos are a species-based approach to conservation, and they are in the business of educating the public, protection of a species under threat, and raising money to be used in conservation efforts more broadly. A negative aspect of the zoo is that the animal is isolated from its ecosystem, possibly not treated well, with an increased probability of disease. The habitat of the zoo may be inappropriate, such that the animal does not breed. Zoos are potentially unethical. They're unsuitable for large species that require large territories. They might be inappropriate habitats for breeding, and they're not an economically feasible solution to the conservation of species. But before you write off the concept of the zoo, consider seed banks that store the genetic diversity of the world's plants. Is a seed bank worth the cost? Who pays the cost? There are various ideas for the specific conservation of species and ecosystems. We can create nature reserves or national parks. We can control alien species. We can restore degraded areas. We can reduce exploitation by humans, reduce habitat destruction. And we can take political or legal action by national and international agencies. So in an attempt to evaluate the species-based approach toward conservation, I ask, what are the relative strengths and weaknesses of the following species-based initiatives? The Convention on the International Trade of Endangered Species, known as CITES, captive breeding and the reintroduction of organisms to the wild, and zoos. Here is a slide that I presented earlier evaluating the species-based approach to conservation. I'll let you study this slide on your own. So as I head toward the end of this movie, I'll do a bit of reviewing and add some lingering ideas, but it's important to note that a mixed approach to conservation is best, a mixture of species-based and habitat-based approaches. Ultimately, if you had to decide, the habitat-based approach is the strongest approach, simply because by conserving the habitat, you conserve many, many species. So in review of a species-based approach to conservation, we've looked at the specific species, knowing exactly what it is we're trying to conserve. We've looked at aesthetic, beautiful, emotionally resonating species, species that are interesting, flagship species that gather the popular support of people. We've looked at ecologically important species, keystone, umbrella species, and we've looked at top predators. By conserving the top predators in the system, you conserve the entire system. We've looked at species-based conservation activities such as law and the enforcement of law. CITES of 1973 is a perfect example. We've looked at captive breeding and the reintroduction of species to their native habitat. We've looked at zoos and seed banks. And in review, we've looked at the habitat-based approach to conservation. This is the better approach, but it is more difficult to accomplish. By conserving habitat, many species are conserved. By conserving habitat, services, ecological services, are also conserved. The activities for a habitat-based approach to conservation would be to build reserves, build parks, protect large tracts of land. To wind this movie down, here are a few more ideas on conservation. Remember that scientific knowledge is available from intact ecosystems. In intact, undisturbed systems, we can measure ecosystem variables. It is from data collection that we know what species are most threatened. We know a lot about birds and mammals, but not much about others. All of this would be a reason to support the habitat-based approach to conservation. How do we make decisions, prioritize about what species or ecosystems to conserve? Scientific knowledge is available from intact ecosystems where we can measure the density, diversity, percent frequency, or percent cover of species. This would be a reason to support habitat-based approach to conservation. Habitat restoration, as can be seen in these images, is a conservation effort that includes the reintroduction of individual species to the habitat. This is an example of an intersection of the species-based and habitat-based approaches to conservation. We can conserve species by eradicating invasive species, but when an invasive species is eliminated, the entire habitat benefits. This is another example of the intersection of the species-based and habitat-based approaches. These boxes in the image are meant to trap stoats, a weasel relative in New Zealand that eats the eggs of endemic birds. The eradication of non-native invasive species would include non-native invasive plants, as can be seen in these images. Eradicating invasive species protects native species and ultimately benefits the entire ecosystem, the habitat. Technology can be used to assist in the study and conservation of species. Polyculture, diverse farms, agriculture with many species, encourages biodiversity, reducing the loss of species. The conservation of species can be assisted by reducing the monoculture of modern industrial farms and shifting to polyculture to increase diversity. Here is a slide you've seen before. You can turn the movie off now and study it. Here's an additional slide with various ideas on the conservation of species and habitats. I'll let you study this slide on your own. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS Biodiversity and Conservation Part 9.